Dr. Keith, you've written a few books relating to the mission schools of Malaysia and Singapore. How did your interest in this area of architecture get piqued? Did you go to a mission school?
Yes, I did. I went to St. John's Institution. So I graduated 1989 for SPM. So my interest was quite long-standing in the sense that not that I'm an architect by training. I lecture in architecture in Taylor's University. But before that, I was working in industry for 9 years, both in the UK and Malaysia. And I think it's interesting that at least my interest in heritage architecture only really peaked after I became a lecturer. Because in industry, in a sense that as practicing architects, I had not enough time to be interested in heritage in a way. But after becoming a lecturer, I became actually very, very passionate. And we are all encouraged to publish in universities, for research universities. And so we have to publish. And when this originally started, rather than initially publishing academic papers, I decided, well, how about writing books? And writing books about a topic that was close to my heart, which was mission schools. It came almost naturally. And I found that it was an interesting gap of research, as we call it in academia, because there are not that many books published about mission school architecture. There are several books published about mission schools to do with especially alumni associations and so forth, where they talk about the history of the individual schools. But with regards to the architecture of the buildings, very, very little has been said. But that story itself is very worth telling, and it's very, very important for heritage in Malaysia going forward. So yeah, so that was perhaps the crux of the reason behind it.
And if you could recall, if there was one such thing that kind of made you feel like, oh my gosh, this is it, I'm in love. Like you said that it only happened, after you started lecturing. What was it?
Okay. Well, what it was actually was, what was it? uh, it was much more mundane than that. I think as if there are any university lecturers listening into this, they will have heard the term publish or perish. And university staff are always encouraged to publish academically. And this is a task and a KPI being given to us. And as a result, it started out on a very mundane thing. I said, okay, I'm going to have to publish something. So why don't I publish something which I am actually interested in writing? And so that interest started. And I found when I started actually writing about the mission schools, the interest grew and grew. It became very, very large, to the extent that after I finished my 2 books, I also did a PhD about mission school heritage. And that process has been extremely informative. It's mentally and emotionally very satisfying. I got to meet a lot of very old missionaries, former teachers, alumni, and so on, all very, very supportive people who supportive of the schools, their ethos and their architecture, the preservation, conservation of the architecture. So that was that kind of process and those steps, which was personally very meaningful for me.
A slow and gentle love affair that's ended in great passion. Lovely. So we're talking about
You say it very poetically, Asha. Yes.
Well, thank you. So we are talking about schools this week. Can you tell us about the importance of mission schools and their contribution to the country's education system?
Sure. I think older listeners will find the answer very, very obvious. For younger listeners, it's perhaps a bit more difficult thing to recall or understand. I will start by saying that, unfortunately, the major contribution of mission schools is mostly a thing of the past, and I'll come to why. Mission schools, of course, have a very long heritage in Malaysia. The earliest mission school is actually started in Portuguese Malacca in the 16th century, but that school has long been lost. It was lost during the Dutch conquest. So what we call mission schools today can mostly be traced to the mid-19th century, specifically 1852. 2 earlier schools in this region were actually St. Xavier's Penang and St. Joseph's Singapore. From there, they spread out throughout Malaysia. And in West Malaysia in particular, the major mission institutes were the La Salle Brothers and the IJ Sisters, Infant Jesus Sisters. So between them, they have several dozen schools. Now, I was going to say a few hundred, but the number will be very, very different depending on the source you read, because it depends whether you consider a primary school and secondary school a different school. Right. It depends whether you consider a Sekolah Satu, a Sekolah Dua, a different school. So sources which consider all these schools separate, you'll see the number of mission schools will be quoted in the hundreds.
Hmm.
If you're talking about architectural campuses, then the numbers will be in the high dozens because you've got many, many campuses. So in terms of architecture, the very, very significant ones, probably talking about a couple of dozen of very significant ones, and significant in terms of the uniqueness of the era of architecture, the age of the buildings, and so on. And they occur in most of the major town centers. And I think the interesting thing about the LaSalle and Convent schools in particular is that boys and girls, the buildings are near each other and they're very easy to read, and it's very, very poetically linked. Coming back specifically to your question about the importance of their education, during the time of English medium schools, the mission schools were very, very important, and roughly half the students who graduated from English-speaking schools before the Second World War would have gone through the mission system. So you're talking about the system which contributed approximately half or more than half of the students in the English medium before the war. Now, after the war, but before the language of instruction was changed, the mission schools were still considered the leading schools in the country due to academic performance and also due to numbers and so forth.
Mm.
Now, after the language of instruction was changed, post 1970s, that status has gradually decreased, unfortunately. Depending on your point of view, you can call it a democratization of education. If the government says, look, I want to have lots and lots of reasonable schools across the country, we don't want this elitist idea of having the old English language schools as the so-called top of the crop or elite schools. If you view it from that point of view, then it's good that you've got democratization. If you view it from the idea that let's have centers of excellence of state-run schools, then it's unfortunate. Because just to also put a caveat, mission schools are all now government assisted, which means that the government pays the salary of the teachers, it pays for some upkeep of the buildings, it pays for most of the utilities and so on. But for general full upkeep of the buildings, the government does not always contribute, seldom contributes the full amount, because these are only partially assisted schools. So as a result, in recent times, you've had the issue that these very, very well-known schools are starting to lose their position because of basically they're not as well funded as government schools. And also in many cases, there are in old city centers where there are now not much of a catchment population who would naturally go to these schools. So you've got lots of suburban schools, government suburban schools, where the middle class sends their children. And for the old city center schools, then they don't get this catchment of middle class students. And that becomes an issue with regards to, for example, school performance and so on and so forth. Of course, there are still very good mission schools, but the general importance that they once held in the system has unfortunately degraded through a variety of reasons, which I could spend hours talking about. But just to give you a summary to your question, that perhaps summarizes it to some extent.
Okay. Wonderful. And that, as you said, that I have so many questions swimming in my brain, but we don't have hours,
Sure.
unfortunately. So I guess let me ask you this then. What about their contribution in terms of the country's history? Are they part of our heritage or part of a colonial past that really should be sort of kept in the past? Bearing in mind, we are talking
Mm,
about schools and what's been happening recently. Um,
sure. Yeah. Okay. A very, very good question. Certainly, I would consider it part of Malaysia's heritage, and the bulk of every single person I've spoken to, regardless of religion, has said they consider it part of Malaysia's heritage. This is certainly all the alumni, as well as people who are involved in heritage bodies who are not alumni. All of them consider it part of Malaysia's heritage. Also, want to just mention that during the time that I did my PhD and I interviewed lots of people about mission schools, I would very, very honestly say that the most passionate supporters are by and large not Christians, not Catholics, not Christians. There are lots of passionate supporters who are Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus who came through the school system, and they have a very, very strong feeling for these places. And the reason is because the ethos of the major mission institutes was not to convert people to Christianity. It was not that. It was to give a holistic education, a humanistic and holistic education, which they did very, very well. And because of that, they've got this groundswell of goodwill from these alumni of various religious backgrounds who support them. So why do I then say that this is part of Malaysia's heritage and not colonial? For one thing, the mission schools were not built by the British colonial government. they were actually built by religious institutes coming from France, okay, the De La Salle and IJ. And there are other religious institutes who come from other countries, including Italy. But I will focus on the De La Salle and IJ because they are the major groups in Malaysia.
Yeah.
So if you imagine when they first started coming to Malaya, and the antecedent or the group that was buying land for them, which was the Paris Foreign Missions, called MEP, Mission Étrangère de Paris. So these people are all French groups. And in the time that the French missionaries started coming to Malaya, uh, Britain and France had just come out of the Napoleonic Wars. They were enemies for generations. And yet you had British settlements in Malaya, which were allowing these French missionaries to come in. In a way, it's a very, very unusual story. But it's also a story talking about cooperation between parties who are always competing, but they find areas to cooperate. And I think that's a very, very good analogy for Malaysia today, where if we look back at our history, and even countries at war, empires at war, can invite people over to give education and share knowledge. Certainly in a country, in a plural society like ours, with lots of multiracial wealth and richness, but also disagreements on certain issues, surely we can find common ground to go forward in terms of education, which is important to all of us. And I think the mission schools show that possibility. And because of that, because they are not, in no way were they built by the colonial governments, they are certainly, in my opinion, Malaysian heritage. And because, again, one other thing to mention was that in all the cases of all the mission schools, from founding onwards, all of them accepted students of any background, any religion, and they were always local students. So again, these schools were not set up as quote unquote expatriate schools for Europeans. They were always meant for locals. So because of that, and so several generations of Malaysian students went to these places. In the case of the very prominent schools, and you alluded to CBN, you perhaps didn't name it, but you alluded to it because it was in the news recently.
Yes.
So of course there have been former ministers, royalty, and so on who went to that school. And so it shows you that these schools catered to Malaysians, rich and poor, right? So you've got lots of mission school alumni who are well known in business, in politics, and in the royal families and so on. But you also have people who are fishmongers and nasi lemak sellers who also went to mission schools. So it's that great melting pot of social classes, as well as a melting pot of religions and racial groups, which to me is quintessentially Malaysian, and therefore something to be very proud about.
I absolutely love what you just shared. It's blown my mind a little bit. I just wonder whether or not you had any opinion or knowledge on, the way the curriculum was taught, especially sort of lately. So obviously, it came from, with its own set of, I guess, curriculum from when they first started opening up here. But obviously in sort of, I suppose, post-war and onwards, the curriculum has been following, I guess, what the local curriculum is in a way. It's just taught in English, right? So what was different about the way that perhaps mission schools were run that invited such open dialogue and sort of a multicultural hot pot to happen and flourish, as it were, versus other schools?
Okay, good question again. Several reasons. First reason is that the mission schools, this is pre-Merdeka and certainly pre-1970, they had a very international staff. You had the number of De La Salle brothers, for example, in Malaysia peaked at around 200 in the late 1960s. And the number of IJ sisters peaked at around 600, if I recall my data from also roughly that time. And if you look back at the archives of the brothers, the terms of nationalities of brothers who taught in Malaysia, would have been about 20 countries. Okay, so around 20 different nationalities were represented. And in some of the larger schools, you perhaps had 4 or 5 nationalities at the same time. When I was in St. John's in the 80s, we had a brother from Burma, Myanmar, a former headmaster from Canada, local brother, and another brother from the Czech Republic. And these are just in one school, right? And there were just 4 of them, and each of them came from a different country. So because of that, there was always this international flavor and this idea that when you come to this school, you are exposed to a greater world. You're given a flavor of a greater world. Because remember, this was a pre-internet age, right? So at the pre-internet age, how often would one meet such and such people? Basically never, almost never, especially if you're in school, or unless you've traveled a lot. So that gave these schools a flavor of internationalism before we come to the current idea of an international school where you pay a huge amount of money to attend an
Yes,
international school.
exorbitant, I think is the right word,
Exorbitant
Doc.
amount of money.
Yes.
Correct. Whereas in the past, you could get schools with headmasters from Ireland and Scotland and so on, and it's free basically because they're a mission school. So you just go, it's free. And because of that also, I think one caveat about school integration perhaps is, I think language is, I know it's a politicized issue in Malaysia, and I know many pundits would have already commented on this. But when you're talking about using language as a tool of integration, it's actually quite interesting and important. Why was English perhaps successful? And people who are now trying to bring back English schools will repeat or have already said what I say. Well, English was not anyone's mother tongue, you see. So because it was not anyone's mother tongue, it was considered a neutral language that no one gets, emotionally bent out of shape if you use the language. And it wasn't even the mother tongue of the missionaries originally, that their mother tongue was French, the earlier missionaries.
Right.
So because of that, that English language became that bridge, that social bridge, that cultural bridge that everyone accepted. So when that shifted, then of course now you have issues. Now you've got your very vernacular schools, and you've got your Sekolah Kebangsaan, which although they are national schools, especially in the primary section, they're very monoracial now. The secondary section, yes, they are still mixed. Why? Because the primary vernacular schools send students to secondary schools, and it's mixed, which is fine, which is good. But at the same time, you've also got Sekolah Agama and so on, which although they are not meant to separate people, by effect, you are separated by religion. So there's that level of separation as well. So separation doesn't occur just because of linguistic reasons. It also occurs because of religious reasons, which we currently have in this country, in our education system. Again, in the mission school case, their intake was always predominantly non-Christian, all of them, all the time. And they, despite that, or because of that, sorry, they were popular with all ethnic groups, which is a very, very good thing. So I think to some extent that's why they were successful in that early idea of mixing, because, well, they treated everyone the same. There was this ethos of being, how shall we put it, a family, being part of a family, right? It's like saying you go to mission school. Now, especially the convents, because for the convents, they all have the same badge. So you could go to a convent in Taipei, in Penang, in KL, in Seremban, in Malacca. Everyone has the same badge. It's convent. And the only caveat is bracket Seremban, or bracket Pulau Tikus, or bracket Bukit Nanas, right? But they've all got the same badge. So it's the idea of being part of a larger family. And in the La Salle schools, the La Sallian family and so on. So even that is the idea of, I'll meet you, I'll meet some person somewhere. And, oh, you went to such and such St. Michael's. I'm from St. John's. Oh, we have something in common. Which you don't have, of course, in our current system, in the Sekolah Kebangsaan system. By the way, I'm not criticizing the national schools in any way. I think everyone makes decisions based on what they consider a good thing. But good people can disagree, you see. So people who are very supportive of one system or another will be very supportive for what they consider all the right reasons. And then they might meet someone else who doesn't support or feels differently for what that person considers all the right reasons. And I think the beauty of a country like Malaysia is that when we have all these different opinions, if we do have that unity in diversity and that ability to dialogue about things, I think that helps us move forward. Yeah. So
I think it might help if we all had a badge. Okay, let's talk about the architectural preservation perspective. You've said that it's important to consider this in a holistic manner. And what do you mean by this?
Yeah. Okay. Basically, from an architectural point of view, one thing to remember is that the conservation of old buildings is a very expensive exercise. Very often, it costs less to build a new building than to conserve an old one. So that's what I mean by holistic. Now, the reason I say that is because you do have situations where building owners themselves actually don't want their buildings conserved. And I don't just mean mission schools, I just mean in general, people who own old buildings. Give you an example. Imagine now you are the owner of a very, very old house, a 100-year-old house, which is, everyone says is very pretty. But it leaks, it's settling in one side, there are termites, it's cracking, all kinds of weird things are happening to it. But it's a very nice house. You personally, because you don't have servants to maintain a 25,000 square foot house have decided to move into this beautiful condo in Montiara, but your family owns this beautiful house in somewhere else. And then you decide, one fine day, a gentle developer knocks on your door and says, I'll pay you 50 million ringgit to buy your house. And you're excited, say, wonderful, let's do it. Then you look through the thing and you suddenly find out, my gosh, this house is on a short list for listing as a national heritage. Then what do? Okay. So the reason I put that example is that that is the reality faced by some owners of very old properties. What is lacking is funding from external parties. The government does have funds for maintenance of heritage buildings, but the funds are not that much. So you can only get a lot of maintenance sometimes. So I'll give you an example of a recent one, which was the Anglican Cathedral in Penang, St. George's. So that was fully renovated and restored by the government a few years ago, one of the very few instances of church restoration funded by the government in West Malaysia. Mm-hmm. But those are few and far between because the funds are limited, very limited. So because of that, some people who own heritage level buildings, but which are not yet gazetted, some of them get a bit nervous about gazettement. And this is not just the case in Malaysia, it happens worldwide. In Bali, Indonesia, for example, there's a lot of temple trustees who are very against UNESCO listing because they fear that once I list my temple, I can't do any renovations, I can't change any materials without getting permission from UNESCO, which is a very long process. So some countries like the UK, the way they fund heritage is they have a lottery. They have a national lottery and that works. And because people gamble, they spend a lot of money and then the lottery collects money and then they pay for heritage conservation that way. Now, obviously,
I did not know that. That's incredible.
Well, that's, yeah, one of the methods.
Yeah.
And of course, for social reasons, we can't do that in Malaysia. We can't start a lottery.
It's a shame we could start it for the good purpose of that, though. Do you know what I mean? Just for anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Well,
yeah.
So money is a problem. So I think if stakeholders can come together and agree a good model of funding that suits everybody and keeps everyone happy, then it helps a lot. Why architectural conservation is so important, though, is because architecture proves that something happened. If you don't have architecture, if you remove architecture, in theory, future generations may not believe that certain things happen because there's no tangible evidence. I allude to that primary school in Malacca, the 16th century primary school, which was located in the grounds of what's now called the Chapel of St. Paul. There's no trace of that primary school left. Only the historical record says it was there, but there's no trace of it. So if people choose to disbelieve that historical record, and going forward, technology will allow people to digitally alter so much stuff that it might be starting, you can't even believe a video, right? You can't believe a photo. So some people may eventually stop believing archival records because they think it's been digitally altered. But you can't digitally alter a building that's sitting out there physically in the sunshine. So that's why architecture is so important, because it's an anchor of history. It's an anchor of knowledge. And society without a past can barely understand the present and the future. It's like, imagine if we all have collective Alzheimer's, we all suddenly wake up and we can't remember what happened yesterday. Our lives change, right? We don't know where we are. And so that's why heritage conservation is so important. And but funding is an issue. But I guess funding is an issue in life in general. So if funding is the key, if funding comes for old buildings, it will help a lot. And I think heritage conservation has become much more important in Malaysia, or people are much more interested now compared to a generation ago. And the reason is, with development comes interest in heritage conservation. When a country is poor, basically almost everyone welcomes development. You can demolish many things. And people say, oh, as long as there's a new building, new jobs, new skyscraper, new highway, I'm happy. Once a country has reached a certain stage of development, which we have, people start objecting to new buildings. They start objecting to new roads, objecting to new highways, start cherishing the past. So we've already gotten to that stage where people are far more cognizant and far more interested in preserving our history and culture in order to move forward. And maybe I know I'm speaking a lot and I'm giving very long-winded answers. So
no, please. It's fascinating and it's absolutely perfect. So carry on.
Okay. All right, no worries.
Yeah.
So as countries, once I like to I allude to a graph, and although I can't visually show you that graph, I'm just going to describe it. Imagine now there's two dotted lines on an x-axis of the graph. The bottom line says junk and the top line says heritage. All right, and it's an y-axis. And as you move from left to right, it's time. So something that's, imagine you buy a car, and as time goes on, you buy this wonderful new car, and it drops in value, drops in value, drops in value. And at one point, it almost becomes junk. And all your friends are telling you, my gosh, can you please change your car? It's an embarrassment and so on.
Yes, I know what
And
that stage
you,
is like.
okay.
Yes.
And for some reason, you decide, no, I'm not going to throw away my car. I really like it. And you hold on to your car. Now, if you can hold it beyond the junk stage, there will be a bounce and it starts to rise in value. And if you hold it for long enough, it starts becoming heritage, right? A 20-year-old car is considered junk. A 60-year-old car is considered a classic heritage thing. So it's the same with buildings. They run through a stage where they become in danger of demolition. But if they survive beyond a certain age, and in Malaysia, that age is typically 100 years, they become candidates for heritage preservation. And the very pretty ones, and pretty is objective statement, but the very pretty ones, they tend to become candidates earlier because people say, oh, that building is very pretty, it's very beautiful, it makes me feel good, it's etc. So basically, once you go beyond a certain age, people generally will object strongly to the removal of an old building. So it's the idea of allowing society or helping these buildings progress and age gracefully so that people start appreciating them. And beyond a certain age as well, these buildings generate their own wealth, their own income for the country. They become tourist attractions, they become areas of cultural study, academic study, and you can actually make a lot of money from heritage architecture. So there are some evidences of that in both Penang and in Singapore, where some old mission properties have been converted to museums and so forth. And these things have been very, very successful. They've been successful for tourism in the broader sense, and they've been successful for income in the narrow sense of the fact that that building specifically generates income through its new repurposed status.
I was going to actually ask you about, you've written about that as well, about, heritage colonial era buildings in Asia as being a undertapped tourism avenue that,
Yeah.
we can actually sort of use more of perhaps. And would that then generate income enough to actually help other buildings? Do you think it could be a new system we could create to actually help be able to fund all these buildings in terms of
Okay, another good
preservation?
question. Okay, basically, there are two types of conservation. There's a conservation of a building by itself, and there's a conservation of a district of
An
important
area.
buildings.
Okay.
Sorry, like it's like saying foreground and background. So the way it works in the UNESCO zones like Malacca and Penang, there are major buildings. For example, let's say the Capitan Clean Mosque in Georgetown, and that's the major building. And then the surrounding context, the shop houses, are the background, which then get preserved. So the issue of preserving or conserving a zone is to say that I don't just want to preserve the monuments, I want to conserve their context. So the shop house, for example, which when I was very young, I always wondered, why are people so interested in shop houses? They're just these old and dusty buildings, and there's so many of them. Why would anyone want to conserve them? Now, as an architect and as an academic, as a lecturer, I fully understand and fully support that idea of conservation of things like shop houses because they are the context of historical heritage cities. Without the context, it's very difficult for not just locals or tourists, but anyone to appreciate certain things because the context has changed. So you need that to preserve that context in order for something to be seen as a living heritage, and we may come to that. But there's heritage and there's living heritage where the context is still viable. People still use the building in the way it was intended, and so on and so forth, right? And so that idea of living heritage is also vital, and that tends to be something UNESCO talks a lot about. I mean, bit off topic, but for example, Lembah Bujang in Kedah, the Bujang Valley, where there were issues to do with demolition of very, very ancient temples recently. The issue is, can you preserve an ancient temple if the context changes? If the land has been sold for housing estate and you have an old temple in there, even if you preserve the temple, but the temple ends up being in a children's playing field, well, is that good contextual preservation when you've got all these kids jumping around in it, treating it like a playground object?
So I was going to ask you that because one of my questions was, there is this sort of which has been brought to light, this sort of discrepancy, I don't know what the right word is, where you've got the building itself owned by someone and the land owned by somebody else. And as you described with the sort of the temple and it either becoming part of the playground or being demolished, you know, what's the deal there? What's your opinion on what sort of should happen and what are
Okay.
the difficulties?
When it comes to the mission school specifically, by and large, in general terms, most of the buildings and the land are owned by the mission institutes, by and large. In some cases, they're on leasehold land. So yes, the land is owned by the government, but the lease is held by the missions. And then the building is owned by the missions. And then there's all kinds of issues to do with, if you don't renew a lease, what happens to the improvements you've made on the land? You get compensation, etc., because, you know, what happens to the building and so on. But normally, when you have land and you've got a building, the same owner will own both things. I think the issue of ownership is the thing that mission schools, I think, suffer from more. It's not so much that ownership thing. It's the management of the building. Because in a sense, you've got lots of observable buildings which are owned by the mission institutes, but they're not managed by them anymore because they don't have enough staff, they don't have enough missionaries. And all the teachers are civil servants. And most of the headmasters, or all the headmasters, are civil servants, although in theory they're appointed via what's called the doctrine of maximum consultation, where the mission institutes get consulted about, do they agree with an appointment of a headmaster? But basically, you've got civil servant teachers, civil servant staff running a mission school. But issues to do with the building are still addressed to the mission institute because it is known that they are the building owner, they are the landlord. But they are a landlord who receives no rent, right? Effectively, oddly enough, they are a landlord who incurs an expense. They receive no rent from the government for the use of the school, and they actually incur expenses of maintenance of the same building that is being used by the government as a sekolah kebangsaan. So in a way, you've got this unbalanced relationship. And I think that's one problem mission schools have faced. Because in the past, when it originally started, they actually had the position of power and the government had the subsidiary position. And why do I say that? Colonial times, basically the British colonial government initially didn't want to spend much money on girls' education in particular. It did spend money on boys' education to a very limited extent. Girls' education basically did not. So it really invited, especially convent schools, to open because they said, wow, I'm going to be able to educate native children for free. I don't have to send a single penny. These French missionaries are going to do it for me. So wonderful. Let's invite them in.
Lovely.
So the missionaries were in a position of power, the government's subsidiaries, because the government will agree to anything. Well, not anything, but the government will be very generous to the missionaries because they were educating for free. So after that, as time went on, this position slowly gravitated to being co-equal because at a certain point after the 1930s, the government agreed to pay the salaries of the mission teachers. And when the government started paying the salaries, basically this relationship became more equalized. And then after post-independence, this relationship has rapidly become unequal, where the mission institute now has very little power, government has a lot. And so because you've got this change in relationship, this entire idea of how do we move forward is also, you've got this issue. It's like a marriage, really, right? You've got two partners. And if one partner is too domineering and the other is too subservient, you're going to have a problem. And I think that's an issue that we face to some extent.
So you're saying no solution yet? No.
Well, there's no, I think in education, in anything to do with education, there is never a permanent solution. There are always measures, and measures are important. Because why do I say there's never a permanent solution? Children's needs change, societies needs change, countries needs change. And as long as good people always strive to do the best for the next generation, and good and decent people try to do the best for the older generation who are still around, and try to do the best for the country, then things are fine. If people act out of selfish self-interest and forget all those other things and forget the rest of society, then we have a problem. So I think there are multiple solutions, and there are many measures that have been implemented, some good, some not so successful, some perhaps bad. And it's a work in progress. It's a live thing. I think mission schools, as with education in general, is a live topic, right? It's not something that starts and stops. It's something that starts and evolves. So although the idea of mission education has evolved many, many, many times, and there are very few missionaries in the school system per se. You could arguably say it's still around, but it's just evolved a lot. So if you went to these schools before 1970, and now they're unrecognizably different, but it's an evolution. So someone who graduates from a mission school today can still say, I graduated from a mission school. In theory, it's still a correct statement. But that person's experience, this is just very, very different from before.
Okay, so let me just ask you then, if you had a magic wand, you know, architectural wise, here we're talking,
Sure.
what would you like to see happen to all mission schools and other significant architectural buildings in Malaysia? You got a magic wand in your hand.
I will just maybe, before I say that, because the magic wand is such an exciting topic. Also,
but brief. We need a soundbite.
Sure.
Just give us a brief.
All right. I'll make a caveat and just make a comparison in terms of heritage conservation between Malaysia and the UK, the other country I'm most familiar with. In the UK, they've got more than 2 million listed heritage buildings. In Malaysia, the number that are listed as individual buildings numbers in the few hundred. Okay, so 2 million in the UK, few hundred in Malaysia. If you're talking about preserved districts, then we have preserved districts like in Penang and Malacca. Then the number goes into the thousands of buildings here, but they are listed because of the district they're in, not because of an individual listing. So the idea of how many buildings you should preserve, that is also an economic question. Do you preserve everything? The answer is, well, you can't. You can't. It's not realistic, and neither should you. Because if you preserve everything, then you can't. The most extreme version of preserving everything is Venice, Italy, where they've preserved the entire town in the medieval context, and it's become a Disneyland, basically, right? The locals hate it. They keep moving out because they say everything's for the tourists, everything's very expensive. You've converted my living town into Disneyland just because you want to preserve something in the 16th century.
Right. Wow.
So we can't preserve everything. What's important, I feel, is a good evolution where we preserve what is worth preserving, and that's also subjective, but we preserve what we want to use to identify our history and identify a good way forward. I think what we've already preserved is good, very good. You know, the big state buildings, Sultan Abdul Samad, and all the old railway stations, all those things are very important. I think the preservation of schools is quite a recent endeavor, Penang Free School and so on, St. John's and things like the VI. There are many old schools which are not yet fully gazetted. They are on a tentative list of gazettement, but not yet. So that process will be ongoing. The number will grow. So the number is very low at the moment, but it's definitely going to grow, and it's probably going to grow rapidly, which is a good thing because we have very few preserved buildings. And also when you preserve a major building, it's like dropping a drop in a pond and you get these ripples, and it will tend to increase interest in heritage going forward, which will, after COVID, generate income after COVID. Because, look at the idea of Cuti Malaysia, right? We now, well, I speak for myself. I enjoy traveling in Malaysia. I've taken a lot of students to many, many unusual historical sites in Malaysia, and there's a lot of things to see in Malaysia, actually, if we wanted to take a look. But, and as the country develops, the interest in history will rapidly increase, which will generate income. So the small towns, especially like Taipei and so on, which have a good core of old buildings, that will become a source of income. Neighborhoods with old buildings, Bukit Nanas and so on, that will become a source of income indirectly, a source of urban pride, etc. And so that's the beauty of it, right? Because one thing that unites almost everyone is money. So if you can generate money from old buildings, then almost everyone will agree. It's not just an emotional question. It is a monetary question. It's emotional, it's mental, it's monetary, it's economic, it's social. So if we can do good things for good people, but at the same time generate income for the country, it's a win-win, right? So why not?
So I guess that would be the magic wand. It's not sort of the specifics, but it's like having all of those things all together, working together, and then you've got a system that works for the people.
Yeah, in a way,
and everybody. Yeah.
Perhaps one slight, again, very long answer, but again, one slight thing that could help.
We can't go too long in answer because I literally have 30 seconds left with you before we actually have to.
Then I won't. I was basically
sorry.
the craft system, the guilds of craft and plastering and carpentry and so on, those could be strengthened to help in heritage conservation, because we don't have that very deep at the moment. We've lost a lot of those skills. So that's an issue to do with conservation of old buildings. Yeah.
Oh, gosh, yeah, because I was going to ask you about other challenges besides just sort of the financial thing in terms of keeping these buildings in shape.
Right.
Can we just touch on that just very, very
Sure. Yeah.
quickly? Just I'm
Okay.
just
So the
emotionally,
challenges,
yeah.
the challenges are skill based, partially because we're very unusual. We're one of the few countries in Southeast Asia, apart from Singapore, where almost all our construction workers are foreign, right? So in Vietnam, you've got Vietnamese workers. In Thailand, you've got Thai workers. In Indonesia, you've got Indonesian workers. In Philippines, you've got Philippine workers. In Malaysia, so because of that, we have a limited uh, passing down of skills, of craft skills from one generation to the other
Wow,
is
yeah.
very limited because we don't have enough local workers. And that's a major problem to do with upkeep of buildings. And that actually makes the process more expensive, not less expensive, but more expensive,
Right.
because we cannot use the huge numbers of foreign workers for careful conservation work. And that means sourcing workers from China or India or Europe or places like that, depending on where the building came from.
Right.
Or yes, there are local workers, but not many highly skilled ones, and they command a premium, and deservedly so. But if we had the ecosystem of local workers, if we made the construction industry, the manual construction industry, more attractive to locals, pay them more basically, then it would work. And maybe I'll just end by saying that people like to say Malaysians won't work in construction. That's absolutely false. We do work in construction. We just don't do it in Malaysia. Malaysian workers work in construction in Singapore and Taiwan, where they just pay more money. So please pay them more money and they will work here.
Well, that's incredible. Seriously, so much to take on, but I hear you about the sort of the tradesman because looking for people to replicate floors. They don't exist because they're either dead or they haven't passed their skill down because, it's
Basically,
foreign
to
workers right
some
now.
extent,
Yeah.
correct.